Hi, very beautiful community. Happy Sunday. Let's say a few big picture words about the luckily unconsummated attempt at political violence at the White House Correspondents Dinner at the Washington Hilton, where Trump and others in his administration had to be bundled off to safety, and the suspect, multiply armed suspect, has been apprehended. This is difficult to talk about, and we'll get into why. And that's the reason I wanted to make this chat. But let's start with the basics first. Not the information, because you all have the information about what happened, but a quick analysis of what Trump said afterwards. Actually, Trump was not as narcissistically enthusiastic as he could have been. He could have milked this for narcissistic supply much more. He said two narcissistic things. One is that sort of stuff doesn't happen if I get my ballroom. And the ballroom is a product of a kind of toxic monarchism whereby the whims of the leader are thought to be something that shouldn't be obstructed. That leads to a relationship to the White House not as civic space but as effectively personal property. And so there's this unlovely desecrating quality to what Trump's been doing with the White House. But he said if I'd had that, then we wouldn't have had a scare like this. The other thing is that he said that it's only the great leaders like Lincoln and myself who are targeted. But apart from that, he didn't go very far milking this for narcissistic supply, in good part because he was tired and not motivated to do that. He indeed even said that there was a strange unity in the room because everybody was shared in exposure to a common threat. But he could exploit this for narcissistic supply more in the days and weeks to come. Now, the grounding thing to say before we do anything big picture is that, although that is actually big picture, is that what you don't want is for the politics of opponents to become the politics of enemies. And what you don't want is for the politics of enemies to become its extreme version of itself, which is political violence, because political violence is the enemy of democracy. So we've got to be clear about that it's a no and a no and a no and a no and a no to all attempted political violence. But at the same time, and this is what I wanted to talk with you about, a challenge arises about how you strike this balance. So I noticed Jamie Ruskin earlier being conciliatory to the point of saying that he doesn't even have a personal problem with Trump and that the country is essentially divided over the terrible policies of the Trump administration. And so how far do you go while you outrightly condemn political violence to, if you like, diffuse the political tension in the country? Because if you go too far, you'll end up saying that Trump's a nice guy with who you disagree on a couple of policies, and that'll then misrepresent the story. So what you've got is this very difficult balance, not just for you to keep in private, but for public figures, when they apply language to the situation, to balance in public about how far you say that this is really, really, really bad, without any qualifications, and how far you say this is really, 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 really bad. At the same time, something else is true, and that's that you could have very toxic politics, a very toxic political atmosphere, very toxic and divisive political actors, right, who increase the chances of bad things happening. And this is really very difficult to balance, and when events like this happen, journalists, even from Democrat-favoring platforms and institutions, tend to push guests to say, yes, but surely there's nothing personal here. Surely you don't really have a problem with the President of the United States except with the policies. And now let me say how you should balance that difficulty in public? And then the answer is that you can't unless you're always and ongoingly engaged in a certain very important bit of work, even when no political violence is occurring. And that work is about teaching citizens that democracies function through crisis, that crisis is a version of normal in a democracy if you look at history. We've got a very difficult crisis because our democracies are at risk of collapsing into something that is much milder and much less terrifying than what happened during the Second World War in Europe, middle of the 20th century, but it's also a lot less reversible than what happened then. So we're in a worse position and a better position at the same time. But how do you talk about this in a balanced way? It has to start with this bit of civic education where you teach people that just because your democracy is in crisis, right, it doesn't mean you start in engaging in the application of physical force upon people who are your political opponents or your political enemies. That is completely unacceptable in a democracy. But what you've got to do is teach citizens that this level of crisis is not ideal, but it is something that democracies in the past have lived through, and it is an extreme but still a version of normal for democracy. And so just because that's happening right outside your window, right on your phone, on your tablet, on your screen, it doesn't mean we tear our hair out and sort of say that it's the end of everything. It isn't. It's a state that is to a degree sustainable for democracies, partly because they can over time reduce the toxicity and reduce the level of crisis, partly because even when they can't, they've got institutions that have a degree of robustness. Now, institutions in a democracy can't survive for more than 15, 20 years, really, unless they are backed up also by some kind of semi-constructive political culture. But even if they're not, they are going to survive for a very good period of time in most cases. So that's the first thing you've got to put on the table. And if you put that on the table properly, right, that then allows you to condemn violence without denying the crisis. Because what a lot of people are forced into doing when a bit of political violence or attempted political violence occurs is to pretend that there is no crisis as a way of coming across that sort of fully gives the impression that you are completely and categorically, as you should be, against all political violence. So there's a temptation to say, hey guys, let's calm this down. Things are under control. We've got disagreements about policies, and therefore it's important to bring the temperature down. But that's not the correct way to condemn political violence. You don't need to condemn political violence and then qualify that with a diminution of the real level of toxicity in your politics. You've got to be able to name it. And so you can say, we have a government that is trying to undermine counter-majoritarian democratic institutions. We have a leader with a strange monarchist, might is right, partly fascicized ideological orientation. We've got a leader with a personality disorder who is acting in a very destabilizing way on the global stage, etc., etc., etc. There is no reason to not be able to say that and also say, I outrightly condemn all political violence. You don't need to change that first bit to, oh yeah, we do love Trump after all and he's a great guy, it's just a bit of a policy disagreement. That is not necessary for the outright condemnation of political violence. And it's a very important point to make, and you've got to have the courage, if you're speaking in public, to do both. Now here is a bit of a qualification to this. And the qualification is this. How you balance this does depend on whether the bit of violence was attempted, whether it was real, and whether it was something that, represented a great degree of gruesomeness or a great scale or a great deal of sort of shocking political outcome. The more gruesome it is, the more shocking it is, the bigger the scale, the more moderate indeed you do have to be in the way you strike this balance. So, for example, if something terrible happens, where there are victims who are political representatives, then you do have to understand that what you say in the first day or two is different to what you say at the end of the first week, and different to what you say at the end of the second week, because there you have to have a sacredness of focus on the one thing that matters most, which is a terrible, act with terrible consequences that's occurred, right? And there you do have to have a little bit of a delay in how you bring in the full sort of balancing out analysis. You can still mention it, you can still give that context, but you should have a sense of priority, right? So if you say 10 things, 7 or 8 should be about the outright condemnation of the political act and its terrible consequences, right? But when it's an unconsummated bit of political violence, where nobody is hurt, you can outrightly condemn it, but spend more time talking about wider political factors, right? And you've got to strike this balance in a healthy and flexible way, but it's also got to be a courageous way where you don't go for the perhaps easy answer, which is to say after an event without any fatalities that you've got a couple of disagreements on policy with Trump, without actually naming the degree to which he is a toxic political actor. So that's a little bit about this thing that we don't talk about enough, which is how we balance our economy of ethical sentiment in response to terrible things happening, and then how we reproduce that if we're a political actor in public. But all of this becomes easier if this narration happens that we started with, right? And that narration is about how we've got to normalize the idea that democracies live in crisis, that democracies live through crisis, not because that's a good thing for democracy, but because if it's happening, it's something that can still be sustained for a period of time, and we don't need to pull our hair out as though it were completely unsustainable. I hope that balancing act helped a little bit. Lots of love, beautiful community. Catch you in the week.